Directed by Carlos Gotia, we are talking Play Dead from 2025. And I guess this falls into the type of Texas Chainsaw Massacre style slasher movies. But it almost feels like this is part of a movie. So the story starts with a basement somewhere of a serial killer with a pile of bodies, a pile of female bodies. Which have been dumped in this basement, and the killer has obviously gone out, collected a load of women, killed them and dumped them in this basement for use later on. But one of these women isn't actually dead, just unconscious, and she ends up waking up and has to try and figure out a way to escape and what the situation is whilst kind of playing dead to try and avoid detection from this killer. What will happen, you'll have to watch the movie and find out. So yes, this kind of feels like part of a movie in a way, and I don't mean that necessarily in a negative. It's obviously a stylistic choice, really starting at the point where everyone is already kind of kidnapped. We don't ever see these girls being stalked or kidnapped or anything like that, and we start this point almost through halfway through the story, so to speak. But it sort of works, because it has this sort of this woman really waking up, not knowing where she is. So we are in that kind of boat with her to a degree. So it's a stylistic choice. The movie's actually relatively short as well. It only runs just over an hour. So, you know, the story is quite slight, but it hasn't got a really long time. So the story that it has got isn't like particularly stretched out. So let's get into a little bit more detail about it. What do I think works in this movie's favour? Now, if you are a fan of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and that like effed up family, hillbilly, kind of messed up inbred type situation, then this might be the thing for you, because there's definitely vibes here. Our killer is a masked, silent behemoth in the kind of the vein of Leatherface, who likes to dress up his victims and things like this. And you'll learn more about the reasons why he's doing it as the film progresses. So I won't give it away. But he's certainly a kind of a threatening character, and he's quite brutal. And I mean, I don't want to give anything away, but we do see him dispatch one person, and not our protagonist. So it's kind of like you just see how the casual way he just kind of kills someone. So we can tell he's quite a brutal individual, and the movie, despite really starting at a point where you might expect like the second actor to be in another movie, for example, I do feel you can get everything you really need from the plot without having to kind of spelling out the backstory of how these women got there and everything. We get all the information that we need to get, to be honest with you. So in a way, I actually quite like that stylistic choice, because it makes the movie feel like, having its own voice to a degree. And as I say, I do think it works in the point of the confusion of like, where am I? Because this woman wakes up, she doesn't remember really being kidnapped or anything. She just remembers coming out of work and waking up here. So I actually think that sort of choice does work. I also quite like the way our protagonist is clearly quite switched on, and she sort of plays dead to try and avoid the fact that she's a survivor, and how she's able to use her smarts to try and, at least for the most part, avoid detection and try and find, weapons, or she's tried to kind of like, tend to her wounds because she has been stabbed and things like this. So she actually comes across as quite a resourceful character without really kind of going into kind of Mary Sue territory here. So I sort of quite liked it, and I've got to say, I like the kind of the set design here. Again, it all looks grimy and dingy, and you do get a sense of sort of the isolation and helplessness that this woman might be feeling. In actual fact, I would arguably say she would probably be she's maybe a little bit too calm, to be honest. Which leads me to what doesn't work. I do think maybe the character would panic a little more than she actually does, because she's very resolved. She's very sort of calm under this pressure, and I guess there's people like that. But you know, it does seem like she almost immediately is kind of goes into this survival, resourceful mode without really having any kind of like sense of panic or anything like that. And I just don't know how many people would, if you wake up in a pile of corpses, how many people would be as composed. So I maybe have a little bit of an issue with that, and obviously that would defeat the whole purpose of the story, because she's avoiding detection by playing dead. I also have to say as well, because at points the killer is very close to her. In actual fact, in one point he picks her up and he's putting makeup on her. There's no way that he wouldn't be able to tell that she's alive. I mean, she'd be breathing. He's putting like lipstick around on her mouth. He'd be able to feel the breath. He'd be able to see her chest, and she'd be warm, for Christ's sake, you know. So for someone who is a serial killer and obviously has no problem with corpses and stuff, I would presume someone who is a prolific serial killer would know the difference between a corpse and someone that is alive. So it was a little bit sort of silly that at one point, you know, he's not able to tell that she's actually alive and just posing as dead. There's also a couple of other silly elements. For example, at a point in the movie, you know, he realises that she is alive, and you know, the chase around the house kind of ensues, and then she simply is keeping him out by putting like a kind of like a chain lock, one of those kind of chain locks you put on a door that you can kind of, you know, open part way. And this stops him for about a good like 60 seconds. And I'm like, no way. Anyone this guy's size would easily be able to just kind of push through this sort of this kind of chain sort of lock, you know, if you know what I mean. It doesn't, that wouldn't stop anyone if they really wanted to push their way through a door. So again, there's just some sort of elements here that don't really make a hell of a lot of sense, to be honest with you. I think some people, even though I do think this movie does sort of make sense in the film that it presents to us, some people may feel this movie doesn't have a lot of meat on the bones. You know, maybe it could have done with a little bit more context as to who these people are, you know, seeing them getting kind of kidnapped, because in a way you sort of feel short-changed. As they say, this movie kind of feels like part of a film. Running at only kind of just over 60 minutes, you almost feel shortchanged in the fact that this movie almost feels like it starts at the second act, and you've missed the setup and the character development and things like that. And it's definitely obviously a choice to do that, but at the same time, you almost feels like you only watched part of a film. So I actually do think it sort of works in its defence. It's just that I would understand if people did feel a little shortchanged by it, and the remaining kind of movie, or the movie that we actually end up having, is relatively simplistic at the end of the day, because it is such a short run time and it doesn't feel like it has a huge amount of depth to it. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. I think it's an okay film. You know, it's a serviceable sort of slasher movie. I don't think it's anything necessarily special, but if you are a fan of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and its ilk, you may want to check it out. Let me know your thoughts, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.